Hi, listeners. So, last time we discussed the invoking of emergency powers in Canada to deal with protests. A little update in case you weren't aware. Last week, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ended the use of the emergency powers, saying they were no longer needed because the protesters had been largely cleared away. It was probably going to be voted down eventually anyway. So, this way, Trudeau gets to save face. So, that's how that chapter ended. Today, we're again casting our eyes to other countries of the Anglosphere, and today it's New Zealand. Because of what's been going on in Ukraine, events in New Zealand that are a bit similar in some ways to the protest events in Canada have hardly rated in general media coverage here in Australia. So I'm a bit undercooked on what's been going on. So we have Annie O'Brien, digital editor of the Platform New Zealand, the Platform NZ. It's a fairly new independent media site over there. She has worked for the opposition National Party over there, but is actually not at all a partisan hack. That'd be right to say.
Yeah, I try my best. I was actually, I'd say I've traversed the political spectrum personally and in my work. But yeah, I did work for the leader of the opposition for a year. But now again, I'm a free agent, and I'm happily criticizing everyone.
Very good. And like you've got a pinned tweet on your Twitter that says, "To settle speculation about my politics, I've given votes to Greens, Labor, National, and ACT." Is that ACT?
Yeah.
Yep. Over the years, I worked for National in 2021, and you also say you like good faith disagreements and principled people, dislike disingenuousness and Foucault, and care about women's rights and democracy. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good. Yep, that's all me.
Yeah. And your Medium bio says gender critical, lesbian, radical feminist.
Yeah, so I don't even know if I would still use those that moniker anymore, just because things move so quickly, and I feel like so much more politics have been imbued into it. Now I kind of just say I care about women's rights, and yep, I'm a lesbian, so I've got that lens on things sometimes.
Yeah.
But mostly I'm happy to look at things that progress women's rights, and I'll challenge things that I feel like are hindering them. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you can give us a quick summary of what's happening, what's happened, I should say, over the last few weeks, because I don't really have a grasp on it. The coverage has been pretty patchy. So in terms of the protests, are we talking about protests against a particular government policy on vaccinations?
What's actually happened is it's been centered around and anti-mandate protesting, and so that's what everyone seems to all agree on as part of this quite disparate group of people. However, a lot of other grievances have been also getting aired at the protest. So some of them are anti-vax. Some of them are to do with completely unrelated policies, like Three Waters, which is a water ownership saga that's going on. Yep. And a lot of it is anti-government and anti-media sentiment. There's a lot of distrust and a lot of, I think, feelings of alienation among those at the protest.
So you live in Wellington, the capital city where this is happening. So have you had a chance to go and chat to people?
Yeah. So I went down in the first week, and then my boss from the platform has also been down there, and we actually commissioned a survey as well, because we wanted to get a more accurate picture of who was protesting, because there was a lot of speculation and a lot of hyperbolic kind of, it's run by the alt-right, or it's white supremacist, and we really wanted to make sure that we were able to talk to the people themselves and hear who they actually are. So when I went down there in the first week, it actually had a real festival vibe. So people had pitched up tents on the front lawn of Parliament, and there was a lot of music and dancing. It was all very very chill. And I know that it ramped up in that last week, and especially on the last day, it got really bad.
So last day is what, this week or?
Yes, it was Wednesday, 2nd of March.
Okay.
Basically, the police decided that it was time to move in and they were going to clear Parliament. At the same time, there seems to have been an influx of people who were quite keen on a scrap, who seemed either to have joined the protest late or to be using it as an excuse, I would say. And so it turned into quite a violent clash, and tents were lit on fire on the lawn of Parliament. Bricks were thrown. It was quite awful scenes to see. You don't want to see them in your country and your city.
Yeah.
But the lawn has been cleared now. The protesters seem to be trying to regroup. So they have tried to settle at a marae just down just outside of the inner Wellington. But I think there's still some unsettled kind of they're not really settled in anywhere else yet.
Yeah. And is it a mix of white and Maori? Like, what's the breakdown?
So what was really interesting for us is that Māori represent about 14 to 15% of the population in general. And our survey found that 27% of the population at the protests were Māori. So there's about a double representation there.
Right.
There were also a strong representation of Pacific Islander people. Pākehā or New Zealand European were represented probably about fairly accurate with their position in the population. I think the most underrepresented group was Asian New Zealanders.
Okay. And the issue there that they're there for is is there any particular flagship issue that they're there for?
Yeah, so it's the anti-mandates.
Yeah.
Ardern, before the last election, was very emphatic that she would not be introducing any mandates. So then when she did introduce them, there's been a lot of disquiet about it. So we've got quite significant mandates for vaccination, in that initially it was thought that they'd impact about 40% of the workforce, but it's more like 30 from what we're seeing now.
Right.
And so it's virtually everyone in public service, teachers, police, and also some various kind of bits and bobs in the private sector. But then also, because of the use of vaccine certificates in places like hospitality, staff there are also mandated to be vaccinated also. Yeah. So it covered a lot of people.
Very similar issues of being, faced in most of the Anglosphere countries. So I think what's interesting to me also is that, the New Zealand High Court last week threw out a government requirement on police and defence force personnel to be vaccinated. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So it was a judicial review. Yeah. And they found that because one part of our Bill of Rights basically says that if this Bill of Rights is to be breached in some way by the government, it must be reasonably justifiable. And that's
So I'll read what it says. The order, so the order that is the order from the government requiring vaccination, limits the right to be free to refuse medical treatment recognised by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. I'm reading from an article in The Spectator, which quotes the judge, so Justice Cook. Including because of its limitation on people's right to remain employed, and it limits the right to manifest religious beliefs manifest religious beliefs for those who decline to be vaccinated because the vaccine has been tested on cells derived from a human fetus, which is contrary to their religious beliefs. And according to the, what he went on to say, was that the sort of the religious belief argument didn't really fly, but it was the point about the Bill of Rights, right to refuse a medical treatment. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So they took a kind of multiple-pronged attack, and obviously the religious aspect was a weaker part, especially given that not all of the police force and the defence force are religious, so it wouldn't be a blanket kind of application. So it was found that grounds of being able to refuse any kind of medical treatment was what was infringed on. And because looking at the situation in New Zealand as it is today, that breach of rights could not be justifiably could not be reasonably justified. The judge Cook, who is a very respected judge, found that they just really were not able to be justified by the government. And it's very interesting timing, because it obviously happened while the occupation at Parliament was happening, and the government kind of just didn't address it, because they don't need to respond to the judicial ruling for I think about a month. Right. And so what will probably happen is that they'll let this protest die down, and they will remove the mandates before they have to respond in court, because they've shown with other issues that have popped up around the borders, for example, and Kiwis trying to get home, that they will basically push it until they have to respond legally, and then they'll just make exemptions or remove it.
Yeah. It's interesting that the judge said, so I'm going to quote, in essence, the order mandating vaccinations for police and New Zealand Defence Force staff was imposed to ensure the continuity of the public services and to promote public confidence in those services, rather than to stop the spread of COVID-19. Indeed, health advice provided to the government was that further mandates were not required to restrict the spread of COVID-19. COVID-19 clearly involves a threat to the continuity of police and Defence Force services. That is because the Omicron variant in particular is so transmissible, but that threat exists for both vaccinated and unvaccinated staff. I am not satisfied that the order makes a material difference, including because of the expert evidence before the court on the effects of vaccination on COVID-19, including Delta and Omicron variants. I think this is the first time I've seen, no, I'm not comprehensively monitoring, but I'm doing my best. It's the first time I've seen, in a jurisdiction that has a Human Rights Act or a Bill of Rights, a judge actually say, hang on, this vaccination stuff doesn't make sense because it doesn't stop transmission to others.
I know.
And up until now, the judges, at least here, like in Victoria, where they do have a human rights charter at the state level, we're just like, oh, well, the health authorities think it's necessary to have a curfew, and we won't question that because it's a package of measures and we don't know which part of the package of measures is working, and we'll just allow them to do whatever they want. That's basically been every judicial response.
Yeah, I think Justice Cook needs to be given some credit, because he's certainly received some flack from those who support the government or have interest in the mandates being maintained. But I think he gave a very thorough and reasoned ruling, and it'll be really interesting, because what has now happened is that a legal challenge questioning the lawfulness of the vaccination mandate for educators and health workers has now begun at the High Court.
Interesting. So, yeah.
So what will probably happen there is, of course, they're going to use the other ruling to bolster their case. And I suspect what will happen is that this whole mandate thing is going to fall down for the government.
Okay. And you are vaccinated. You're not against vaccines.
Yeah.
You just have to make that unnecessary, annoying throat clearing.
Yeah, it was funny. I was sitting doing my 15 minutes after getting my booster the other day, and reading messages from people accusing me of being anti-vax and all that. And I was thinking, no, I'm definitely not anti-vax. I'm just kind of interested in making sure that freedoms and rights aren't being impinged on in the process of trying to ensure everyone is healthy and not, COVID doesn't rip through the country.
Yeah, you come from a very you've come from a place that's a bit different from the orthodoxy of on the left, which is good. I admit there's something about my personal psychology, which I'm on the left, I think, far left. I admit there's something about my personal psychology and what annoys me about this stuff. It clearly doesn't annoy other people, but I don't like being told what to do. I don't like anything that sounds like a school principal scolding me. I think there's something really weird and neurotic about, and not based in medical science, about this idea that if only we follow all the rules that teacher said and do everything the right way because teacher is watching, then we will beat this airborne respiratory virus. And you just see some very strange stuff, comments from people on Twitter. And I don't know if they're trolling or joking or serious, but stuff like, if everyone wore a mask the correct way, COVID would be over. Okay.
Yeah, it would just, disappear into the night.
or there's like, if this was actually written by, pretty smart political consultant type, sort of a young guy. It was published on the ABC's website in late December when everyone in Sydney was panicking about Omicron, and he wrote the article started at something like, I haven't got COVID over the last 2 years and I intend to keep it that way. Like, as though you've got some say over, like, it's all about you and your, following the rules that's going to make the difference,
Yeah.
just delusional, really delusional. Like, this is, crazy.
Yeah, it is. And I feel like in New Zealand, we've got an extra element of it because there has been a level of fanaticism about our Prime Minister. She almost is the teacher, the mum, the matriarch, who is telling us what to do. And there's almost a real backlash to anyone who, especially publicly, takes a challenge to that or questions the wisdom of something that she has declared.
Right.
And so it's been a really crazy time because you see these really deranged attacks of people who've simply said, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about that. And I think that in part is responsible for what's been happening here with the protests, because it's divided society a lot.
And is that is it just personal psychology? Does some people get annoyed by it, or is there something about economic interests or a way of looking at the world?
I definitely think I every day I believe this more and more. This country is not splitting along political lines; it's splitting along economic lines and power lines, I guess. We've got kind of, I guess, the elites, for lack of a better word, where we've got the government, the media, the bureaucrats, and the kind of, leftist middle class, champagne socialists, I think they used to be called. And then what you see on the other side is the increasingly marginalised, the economically deprived, the people who Jacinda Ardern promised to sort out housing and child poverty for, when both of those have got worse. And so you're getting this disgruntlement from people who are saying, like, I can no longer afford my rent, and that's not because I've lost my job, it's because rents and cost of living have gone up so much. And then the final straw is when they say, well, I don't want to get a vaccine, and they're called scum, and they're called, all those kind of names. So I definitely think it is economic disparity that is driving a lot of this. And it's been quite incredible watching the protests, because you've got people who claim to be leftists, unionists, really, like, you'd think are really in touch with the working class and with protest movements and that kind of thing, have just been almost the harshest of these people who've come out to protest. And you only need to go and walk among them to see that, yes, there are some exceptions to the rule, and there's some, people who are doing all good, but a lot of them are coming from situations of real struggle, and they feel like they were sold a dream in Jacinda, and she was going to be this savior, and she cared, and she loved everyone. And what they've received instead is a harder life, and someone who stands on a podium and lectures to them.
In what way is it harder life? Is that because the way that it's been handled in New Zealand, just with closures and lockdowns and so on, has affected them more?
Yes, so it's a mixture of COVID-related and non-COVID. So on the COVID front, businesses, and when we say that, people think, big business, fat cats, all that kind of stuff. But most businesses in New Zealand are small, and they're family businesses, and they kind of run on the, smell of an oily rag. They're not particularly well off. And these businesses have not been able to trade for a long time, and when they have been able to trade, it's been under heavy restrictions and with limited customers and that kind of thing. So there's been real difficulty on that front from COVID. Then the situation in terms of just general living in New Zealand has got markedly more difficult. Cost of living has gone through the roof. Petrol is now over $3 a litre, $4.91. And housing has just continued to skyrocket. So even rents, it's not just buying now, it's cost of renting. Okay. So and things like social housing. So there were 5,000 on the wait list when they took office in 2017, and there are now 25,000. And so what we're seeing is that the gap between the rich and poor widening.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, the social consequences of that have been increased crime and all the social issues that come with that. It's kind of a summary.
Yeah. That's a good summary. It's so interesting to me. I was just thinking, as you said that, it's so interesting to me that, like, a friend of mine, he got rejected for a rental property recently, and the real estate agent said we have a zero tolerance for history of rent arrears, and he'd been late on his rent, or in rent arrears, for a period of about 12 days a few months ago. And I was just thinking, you're not allowed to reject someone from a property for being black or gay or being a Muslim or whatever, but you there's no problem with saying you were poor back a few months ago. That's fine. That's an irrational form of discrimination, like, because you're not poor anymore, you can afford it now. And
it's not a pattern of illegal, willful skipping of rent. It's different.
But the Human Rights Commission here can't hear a case on discrimination based on being poor. That's the one criteria that's fine. No issues with that. Yeah.
And the thing is that just then creates a almost like a black hole that sucks people in. That you have that one point of struggle that you start with. You skip the rent there. Then you can't find another home because no one will rent to you because you missed the rent back then. So then you're living in your car. So then you lose your job because you're smelly and you're all over the place.
Yeah.
And it just creates this kind of spiral where having a hard time turns into everything's gone, you're destroyed for life.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, so disappointing for me. I voted for Jacinda's government in 2017, but I didn't this last time around. And I had a lot of hope that her empathetic approach meant that she understood those kind of struggles. But it just really hasn't materialized into any like policy that has or legislation that has made a difference in any of these ways.
Do you think, like, I was just thinking, do you think big business, like big retail, loves these kind of closures and lockdowns because it just sends all the spending to them because they're the ones that can do the delivery?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and all the small businesses die. Yeah,
exactly. You've seen not only has there been a massive transfer of wealth, like personal wealth, you also see like the massive corporations which already are going to survive this. They get business directed to them, as you say, because they do the deliveries and the convenience factor. And you have these small businesses who relied on foot traffic and who were much more community based. They've got no way to survive against those kind of beasts who can just, they can quickly okay, we need to swap our model. We need to focus on online sales. We're going to, get all the logistics sorted. A small business can't do that.
Yeah. It's the foot traffic. Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned before there was some challenge coming up or coming before the High Court on the quarantine system, which I think is now history. Like New Zealand's pretty much opening.
It's all happened very quickly. So there was a challenge from what they call themselves the grounded Kiwis.
Okay.
And they have basically, I don't know much about who's behind them, but they became like a collective of all these Kiwis all over the world who were trapped overseas.
Yeah. So this is interesting because the same type of people tried this in Australia, but we've got no Human Rights Act to use to base a challenge on. So yeah, tell me about this. The Human Rights Act says that New Zealand citizens and residents can have a right to return home. Basically, it's very simple. And in my opinion, the government has breached that right steadily over 2 years. There have been people who, for whatever reason, whether it's we've had lots of really heartbreaking stories around trying to get back for dying relatives or funerals, grandparents who've never met their grandchildren, all these kind of things that we wouldn't have thought about in the past. You just jump on a plane and go home. Yeah.
And the government has been very strict on our border, which made sense at the start, especially when we didn't know much about how COVID was going to play out. And then when Delta came along, it was very aggressive and there's plenty to be worried about there. But in more recent times, especially with Omicron, where most of the places around the world we're seeing rapid transmission in communities, having the border open to mostly it's just going to be your own citizens wanting to come home will bring far fewer cases than what already exist in your community.
Yeah, it's obvious.
And so that was the argument that was really getting pushed towards the government, and they were digging their heels in. And then we had the case of Charlotte Dallas. I'm not sure if you guys saw. It got some international media.
I'm not aware of it.
yeah, so she's a journalist, and she was working in the Middle East for Al Jazeera, and she became pregnant unexpectedly. She didn't think she could become pregnant, and she's not married, so she needed to come home because where she was living in Qatar, I believe, it is illegal to be pregnant and not married, and it's a bit of an issue. And her partner, he was from somewhere in Europe, and they wouldn't have her for more than 3 months because of visa issues. So she applied to come home and was rejected on for emergency, I guess, exemption to come home. And it kind of blew up because most people look at that situation and go, why on earth would you say no to that? Like, just let her come home.
Yeah.
But what ended up happening was she had spent a lot of time reporting in Afghanistan from when the withdrawal of American and allied troops. And so she had some contacts in the Taliban.
Yeah.
And so the only place she was legally allowed to live and work, apart from New Zealand, was Afghanistan. So she contacted the Taliban and said, I'm pregnant and not married, but I need somewhere. And they said, well, look the other way. Don't worry, no one will give you any trouble. So she got more support from the Taliban than she did from the New Zealand government.
Oh, that's classic. Yep. Amazing.
Yeah. So that kind of like put the cat among the pigeons, because it stirred stuff up over here. So then they were speeding up the border reopening, and then basically in the last couple of weeks, with the amount of cases we've had and the pressure that's been put on, they have basically, so they've opened now for Kiwis from anywhere can come home, and they don't have to go into MIQ or anything. And they still haven't given us a time frame for just tourists and other visitors.
Yeah.
They're holding out on that, but our tourism industry really needs some certainty there, because they're in big trouble.
Have you got a theory about why they're digging their heels in on this?
My theory is a wider one. It's just that Jacinda Ardern has shown that she operates her cabinet and her government with a vice-like grip. She's very controlled and deliberate. They do polling on everything and focus groups and whatever. And so she's very, very reluctant to let go of control of anything. And we've seen that on basically all measures. She's held on to them just a little bit too long. And so I think it really just is this, I don't know if it's anxiety or need to just in case keep a hold of things. But I think basically it seems to turn out that we have to force her hand each time with either legal challenges or circumstances kind of just making it really untenable for her to continue that stance.
Yeah. I mean, I was really hard on the Australians, especially on Australia before, when we did our first few episodes in the later months of last year. But now I've been to Thailand, and I've been reading a lot about Taiwan and Hong Kong and Vietnam, and now I realize, and Canada, actually, there's a lot of fear and neurotic behavior, and it's not much to do with being Australian. It's about this sort of kind of nexus between politicians and the public, and there's a kind of a loop there, and the media, of sort of creating anxiety, maintaining it, and then like serving the people the harsh measures that are required to satiate the anxiousness,
the fear. I mean, I don't claim to know too much about Australian politics, but on a national level for you guys, I have to say, having not been a particular fan of ScoMo previously, he's at least been decisive on some stuff that I kind of felt jealous of, because we just haven't had that kind of leader who just says, right, this is what we're going to do. I know you're all scared, but this is what we're doing. And that was just a perception from afar, I guess.
But ScoMo has had no, I mean, it's all words. Like essentially Australia split into 8 separate countries and still is.
Yes.
And he's just kind of commentating from the side. So maybe he sounds
I know, well, maybe
decisive.
that's just the soundbite that I get, but I definitely have noticed that just watching Sky News occasionally that I see that New South Wales is doing something and WA is doing something else. So, so I mean, it sounds like it's been as chaotic for you guys as everywhere else.
In terms of WA, like I just try to ignore it because it's just annoys me. But the only theory I have about why completely unscientific, over the top, you could say cautiousness, but batshit craziness is another way of putting the only theory I have about why that is continuing is that the premier there he just can't allow for the fact that he might have been wrong and that he might appear to be a loser or not a winner of so like he doubles down just so that he doesn't appear to have been
to
wrong.
Lose face. Yeah, definitely. It's a powerful motivator, and you see it with like a lot of politicians and this inability to ever say, oh, I might not have got that right, or or let's change tact. It's very difficult for them to kind of take that place. I mean, I look at somewhere like WA and New Zealand, I think we are both the most isolated kind of parts of the Anglosphere. It wasn't that hard to keep it out for a while, was it?
It wasn't that hard. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we didn't have to work particularly hard on that front. And what's been interesting is that both New Zealand and WA, despite those advantages, like geographically and maybe in population sprawl, we've gone like really extreme with the measures, and so we've almost been more extreme in places that were more at risk. It's
McGowan, the way he presents is also very well. You've got the sort of the school principal type of thing with Ardern, but we've got he's got this military leadership thing going on, like with this very belligerent, very kind of aggressive, kind of almost like we're fighting World War II here, very kind of that kind of thing. So just to wind up, I'm just curious about what you said earlier about gender critical label. Could you flesh that out a bit? I was just curious why you said maybe that's no longer something that you.
I definitely still. I still think that it's really important that sometimes we talk about biological sex and the physical aspects of our being, especially when it pertains to women's rights, because for millennia we have lived the way we've lived. We've had certain oppressions, we've had challenges based on our physical being and the role that's been assigned there. So I do still believe that. I still believe that sport, for example, should be organised based the most fairly on biological sex. Perhaps we have an opens category and a women's category. And so I stand by all of that. All I mean by kind of the labels is that I guess any kind of movement just gets hijacked and taken into sometimes into a different space. And I guess I quite like to have some calm and reasoned discussions about how we can retain respect and I guess understanding of biological sex and how it matters, while still ensuring that in 2022 we are making sure that life is is good for everyone, and that people who identify other than their biological sex aren't unnecessarily just like discriminated against or face undue challenges. I think it's a hard one because there are conflicts of interest in there, but I don't think it's beyond us as a society to have conversations and figure out how we can make this work and how we can kind of go, well, actually, it matters here that we know that this is a female space or that this is about sex. But in all these other places, it doesn't matter, and we can talk about gender and gender identity.
Yeah,
that's kind of a very simplified.
Yeah, no, that's just a question that came to me. It's something that is of interest, for possibly another episode. Very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on at short notice, Annie O'Brien, from the platform. Is it the platform NZ?
It's the platform.kiwi is our website.
Okay, platform.kiwi, and I guess fairly new. So there's going to be, I think you said you were doing a podcast now. Is that right?
So it's actually going to be full-on radio broadcast. Okay. We're building our studios. So at the moment, I'm just I've got some written content going up, and we're doing bits and bobs. We did a bit with the protesters because it was just happening.
Yeah.
But we hopefully by the end of the month, our studio will be good to go, and we'll be doing talkback radio throughout the day, and then we'll be creating podcasts additionally that'll be available on our app and website.
Okay, I'll link to the platform in the notes. Brilliant. Thanks for joining us, Loose Cannon. So that's it for Loose Cannon today. Please do get in contact. The email address is loosecannonpod@gmail.com, and my new Twitter with very few followers @JohnOLooseCannon, all one word. And we'd love to hear from you. So thanks for joining us, and see you next time.